same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to this evening's edition of the Open Word. Today's edition, we are continuing our series with Professor Clive Thomas on Guyana's oil. Last week, we looked at the auctions that were scheduled to be conducted since last December. They were postponed, and we took the opportunity to look at why they were postponed, the challenges in doing auctions, also the benefits of doing auctions. And as a result of last week's show, we got some calls. People were asking us to go a little bit more in depth as to, in terms of definition, what really an auction is. You know, sometimes in these shows we take it for granted that people understand some of those quote unquote basic things, but the audience is so diverse that we felt that this week we'll spend some more time on the auctions, especially on the definitional aspect of it. We'll have to ask Professor Thomas to give us a sense of what an auction is, how it's conducted, etc., etc., so that we help to fill in some of the blanks from last week. So let's go straight into the interview. Professor Clive Thomas, good evening. How are you?
Fine, thanks, David.
Yes, okay. I shared with you, and I think you also shared some inquiries that you had about last week's program. The interest was, of course, quite high, but we were asked to fill in some of the little gaps. And one of the first things I want us to start with is really a definition of what an auction is. Of course, we're talking about definition within the context of economics and the oil and gas industry.
I think we should perhaps talk more. We can start there, which I think is very important.
Well, yes. Okay, go right ahead.
And I will start by giving you the broadest sort of definition I can give. And it can come from many standard sources. The one which I've used in my article, which you probably have read, was the one that came from Investopedia. Mm-hmm. That's a finance journal, not really a journal, finance and business collective that deals with issues like defining terms, giving guidance to the industry of how best to proceed in the common use of terms and symbols. And they give the definition as being simply an asset, and in this case is a public auction, that the government really wants to sell, and it finds a modality of bringing together buyers and sellers. And one way you can do that is through an auction. The basic idea is to follow the principles of economics, which suggests that in competitive markets, you always arrive at the best price and the most efficient outcome, not necessarily the most honest outcome or fairest outcome, but the most efficient outcome, in the sense that no buyer will feel dissatisfied having purchased the product, and no seller will feel dissatisfied in that the seller expects that they could have gotten more. So it's really an optimality situation you're trying to create, which in terms of economics is the ideal solution to all economic problems. If you can get the market to arrive at a position where no buyer can gain more from purchasing the product than he has already gained, he or she, and no seller can also do the same, then you arrive at an equilibrium where all efficiency standards are met. It is called in economics a very complicated term because it came after, it's named after an Italian economist, Pareto, and it's called Pareto optimality. That is, competition produces the maximum efficient outcomes at all times. So if you get a price that comes out of a competitive market, no buyer will feel dissatisfied with the price and no seller will feel dissatisfied. If it's beyond, if it's not at that price that you get from the outcome, then some seller or some buyer will be dissatisfied. The seller may feel that he or she did not get enough, and the buyer may feel that they paid too much for what they got. So you're always striving to get to that maximum optimum benefit for all the participants in the market, both buyers and sellers.
But go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
It's organized to create the equivalent of that market situation where with many competitive buyers and sellers, you arrive at an outcome that is efficient in that maximum sense. So we arrange an auction where people bid for items that you put up, and then when you arrive at a price that is the best price that the auction can yield, that price will be satisfactory to both buyers and sellers. And that will also meet the standards of the optimum output or benefit you can get from either being a buyer or seller in the market.
And
so that is course, really, so the auction is really an instrumentality to create a market efficiency outcome.
And of course, you said that it is the most efficient methodology, but not necessarily the fairest.
And it's not always efficient. It aims at efficiency.
Okay.
So one always has the objective of trying to be most efficient, and it has that aim to try to be maximally efficient. But you see, auctions can be defeated by many circumstances and conditions.
Right.
Collusion, the buyers or sellers can get together either jointly or separately with their own cliques and involved in trying to undermine the benefits of the auction. Just for example, a buyer may submit more than one bid to create the impression or the illusion that there are many bidders in the market and therefore the strong market competing for the product. But they are undermining the result because they create the illusion of many bids by being the sole bidder that bids. You can also have the case where the buyers get together, not the sellers, and they also organize so that they can, depending on the type of auction, can manipulate the outcome. So collusion is always a major problem in terms of auctions. And that is why you have to have a government or the agency is organizing a public auction to police it very well, because you know that this is the way in which you can undermine an auction. And there are four basic types of auctions. There's the English auction, which you start with by bidding, and you try to arrive at the highest price. And the person who bids at the highest price, when the market stops bidding itself, no other bidders are there, wins the bid and pays that price. Well, that price, he doesn't pay that, he or she doesn't pay that price. He pays the price of the second highest bidder. That's an English auction. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, you ensure that the person who bids at that level does not necessarily have to pay at that level. They pay what the market was suggesting as the efficient outcome. And that will be the second highest bidder. That's what you're doing in an English auction. But in a Dutch auction, you start at a very, very high price. And you start to come down. You say, well, if you don't buy it at $5 million, you're going to buy it at 4. Who's buying at 4? And you keep going down until you arrive at a price and there's somebody bids, and that price is the price that will be paid. And then you have also closed auctions, where the bidders don't know what the other bidders are doing because the sealed bid. The bid is sealed, so nobody knows what the other person is bidding. And in some cases, the bids are open, where you would know what the other person is bidding because the bidding has to be done publicly. So we have a lot of permutations. I would say scores of them, so that the variation in any given auction will have to be studied very carefully, because there are very many variations, but four basic types.
Do you have a sense of what type Guyana is using or intends to use?
Well, not yet, not definitively yet, because the auction you mentioned was postponed from the original date that was named in December 2022. It should have been done in a way where the results would have been given by mid-April. They've been postponed now to mid-July. And I would think from the evidence that we have so far that the likelihood of that auction being held before the end of next month is not very slim, but it's very dicey. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's postponed further. What are the factors behind that? I don't know. But one of the things which would come to mind might be that they're not getting enough bids, because there's a risk that the bidders have to undertake. It's called the winner's curse. You can come and bid for a product, give your understanding of the market, and when you buy it, let's say the oil price collapses because of the war in Ukraine, then what you paid in terms of expectation will not be materialized. So there are a lot of contingent factors that affect the bids. So you have to be careful, even though you're creating or simulating a market instrumentality to yield maximum efficiency, that you can indirectly end up by creating inefficiencies because it's not an actual market outcome. But it's a market outcome in the sense that there are buyers and sellers, but you're trying to condense it into a particular time schedule, and that raises difficulties. Because you're not prolonging it in time so people get information about each other. And remember, in every market, information is key. And once you have a situation where, let's say, an auction has to be completed by before year end, then the persons who are involved in the auction, who know the most, I think have a strategic advantage. So, for example, Exxon, they are already exploring the blocks, and they would have an advantage in terms of knowing which particular blocks of 1,000 to 3,000 square meters they can or should aim themselves to try to win, because they know the configuration under the sea. Now the government is trying to even that playing field by having two British firms collect the seismic data and the other data showing the dispositions of the blocks on the sea and what results there are that is available to the public. Because remember, this is going to be proprietary information to whoever finds it. They're going to give it away to the public. You can tell everybody where you found the oil. And they're selling that as an enticement for other firms to therefore not be lost in a competition with Exxon if they are competing, in terms of not having as much information as Exxon has. So they're giving out whatever information they have on the topic, and divide these two firms to maximize the government's information. And that is one reason why I suggest we should have a national oil company, because we would know that information ourselves. And we will show that the two firms that we hire to collect it have collected the maximum information available. So that everybody comes into the market with an equal amount of knowledge. and don't have a built-in advantage over the other. So it's a very complicated process. And I wanted to say that it is not something that can be just simply accepted without some critical scrutiny. But it in fact is complicated because surprisingly, although it can give you the best outcome, it is also not substantiated in terms of research that I've seen that in practice that happens. And always it comes back to one primary and fundamental problem. That is the design of the auction.
Mm-hmm.
And the design of the auction cannot ignore what are the goals of the auction. Is the government trying to maximize revenue? Is it trying to maximize discoveries? Is it trying to maximize employment? It is trying to maximize the generation of industrial output and local content within Guyana. What are the aims and goals behind the audit, the auction? What are their priorities? Because the measurement of the results and the success that you obtain from the results will have to be determined by what you set as the aims. So that's why I'm doing the series, because what I wanted to do at this point in time was to get a measure of how much government take we're getting out of the existing PSA, how much recovery resources we have now based on our knowledge of the resources that are there, that have been acknowledged by Exxon, have been acknowledged by the government, and also acknowledged by me as a private independent forecast. So we're trying to collect that type of information. We're also trying to collect information on what is the opportunity time horizon for Guyana to continue to sell oil profitably. I've been working with a period up to at least 2050s. And there's a long rationale for that, but it's based on results of surveys undertaken by the Energy Information Administration of the United States. Because they projected that at least up to 2050, oil will still be the leading source of primary energy. And when it begins to decline, it will decline for many years after, so that it will still grow. But what would be happening is that the renewables will be growing faster than oil for the first time.
Uh-huh.
And many people don't recognize that that's what you have to do. And also you have to recognize that oil is what we call an industry with sunken costs. Because once you establish the framework and the capital structure and all that for oil, rather than abandon it, you sell it for a penny because you get the penny will be a net something. So the extent to which prices can fall are not known now because the nature of the costs of a big industry like oil with heavy capital infrastructure is that the costs are already being built into it. That is why most of the costs are being felt now and being claimed now upfront, because you have to do the construction before you do the actual running and operation of the enterprise or the well. The running costs compared to the exploration and development costs are significant. And once you reach that point, then they, rather than abandon oil, just lower the price to cover what is there to be covered in terms of operations. So the price can be far lower than what it is now, and they could still make money rather than abandoning in the well. It's not a tap you turn on and turn off. It's not a plug and play. You don't move from one type of energy to another by pulling out a plug and pushing it into something else. the whole transition process where costs are already built into the supply of the energy. And the people who are supplying now and who are going to be outcompeted will fight back by reducing prices. So all those things you have to take into account. So it's not as easy as people would say. And that transition takes time. So I feel that we have sufficient time before us to be able to ensure that we can sell all the oil that we can find, at least that we believe we can find as of now, that is available.
You said that you suspect that one of the reasons for the postponement has to do with the possibility of not finding enough buyers, bidders. No. Is there a relationship? Well, there is a relationship, obviously, based on your explanation, between the what you call what is it that the government wants to get out of the auction, and is there's a relationship between that and the number of buyers, of course. Can you explain that relationship? How
Well, I would
how
have to
could you-
hazard a guess.
Yes, right.
And my
How
guess
can,
is
uh-huh.
that the government wants to maximize revenue.
Right.
Because
That's
everywhere they're poo-pooing the existing agreement, as you know,
yes.
and therefore everybody expects a high return. So they're trying to raise the price. Now the thing is that in the market we know that once you raise price, the response of the purchase of that item depends on their elasticity of response, whether or not they can afford to buy at that price and still make a profit themselves. Now they're boasting that the new PSA or production sharing agreement that they produced doubles the government take plus 10% company tax. Now I would be surprised if after all of that, the demand for the oil blocks remains the same. I don't think it's an accident that Exxon has said they're not going to bid until they see the complete offerings and the prices. So they don't have, although they have the advantage of inside knowledge and would be in any instance the preferred buyer, they'd have a big advantage over anybody else. They're not showing keenness, and that might be the strategy as well. Suggests to me that we have to be careful not to overplay our hand and sort of ask for more than what it is worth in terms of competitive global market with oil and the oil.
Go ahead.
So the government has to walk that tightrope very carefully. But I can see them being from their responses and their unsurety about how to handle the constant criticisms. Don't want to face up to that reality. And therefore never really takes the public into its confidence and tries to work out in genuine collaboration with the major, I would say, economic, industrial, business, political, knowledge forces in the country, a strategy going forward. Because you don't want to be egged on to go and, destroy the goose that lay the golden egg. But that's a real possibility now.
That's a real possibility.
Earlier you defensive. Instead of being offensive, and trying to create a national approach, because many people know that a lot of what is being said. Many people who do know, and by know I mean KNOW, real know, realizes that half the criticism is really baseless. A lot of it is pure foolishness.
You mentioned that one of the possibilities in an auction is collusion among potential buyers. Could there be collusion between the seller and the particular buyer? You hold an auction, but you know you really want to sell to, let's say, Exxon or Hess.
Yes,
That
of
happen?
course. Yeah, that can
Yeah.
happen.
Talk a little bit
So
about
the,
that.
so the independence of the procurement office is very important.
Ah,
And this can happen, this collusion can happen even without an auction. Because apart from auctions, you have what they call as beauty contests,
yeah.
where different firms will come to you and tell you they can do this and that, and you negotiate with them bilaterally. And that can also lead to collusion. It can also lead to a situation where, as I think has happened, although I couldn't prove it up to when I left Sarah, where people with inside knowledge might get licenses that they want to flip. So if you have an inside track from some influence you might have in the process,
Mm-hmm.
and you acquire it, you can trade it later on because that's a valuable asset. You just have a track with the rights to do exploration and development without actually having the capacity to do it yourself because you don't have the money, the capital, the skills, but you have the rights, the legal rights. That
Mm-hmm.
becomes a tradable instrument. It gives you a fortune sitting right there. Those are things that the money laundering authorities and the various financial agencies around the world were exploring while I was there.
Right.
To
Right.
what
Right.
extent people were, had acquired rights to things that they didn't really intend to develop themselves because they didn't have the capacity, but was purely trying to be the broker by being the owner.
Mhm. Let me take you in a little bit into the realm of political economy. How can politics, both domestic and geopolitics, impact or influence an auction?
Greatly, because the countries that come to your auction from outside your borders will be looking at their own countries for leverage over your activities and for protection in case there are nationalizations and things like that. The advantage of the PSA is that it is less open to nationalizations and other forms of ownership or of trading in all rights. So many firms have begun to adapt to the realities of PSAs, which, as I said, when it was first introduced back in the 1970s, 60s, were considered revolutionary and really gave rise to the growth of the OPEC and OPEC Plus. Geopolitics always plays a part in major industrial activities, and particularly one as geopolitically significant as oil
Yes, that's
and
where I
gas.
wanted
Yeah, yeah.
you to get a little bit specific about our situation. Mhm.
Yes,
Yes,
so that would be, to my mind, a very significant factor.
yeah, and of course, geopolitics is integrally or interrelated with domestic politics.
Of
How
course.
how does domestic politics play into this? And if you can talk about a little bit about our specific specificity.
Well, our politics in terms of the oil industry and in fact in terms of our economics are dominated by the traditional powers,
Yeah.
dominated by the European powers because we were a European colony. And CARICOM, the CARICOM region, include ex-colonies of Europe. It's also impacted by the peasants of the United States of America as a dominant world power, and right here in our backyard, and has played important roles in our politics over the years since independence, and even before. Canada equally has played some role. So we have to find a means of being able to operate within a context where we're not taken for granted, but we can and should be able to develop some sort of protection or flexibility or intermediation that supports us through the operation of the Caribbean region and CARICOM. That is why I proposed, and I think we discussed already, that the National Resource Fund be expended mainly in the CARICOM region to bring to our defense the rest of the CARICOM region and whatever political maneuvers. But I also have recommended that we go further. I'm expounding this point yet and consider, but we did discuss it before, exploring the possibilities of participation in other groupings like, say, BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa arrangement, because we, I think, would benefit from a multipolar world. And I would believe that we should also think of our oil in more strategic terms.
Yeah.
Do we
See
want
why?
our oil to just enter the market as and when it's produced, or do you want to strategically develop as a player that operates to influence the price?
Yeah.
What we call a swing producer. Because when we start producing 2 and 2.3 and 2.4, 2.5 million barrels a day, we are an important player in the market.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to think how we're going to mediate our position between OPEC, which exists, OPEC Plus, and the traditional European powers, which are consolidating every day more and more around the leadership of the United States, although that might be disrupted with the coming elections and Trump's threats. So we have a complex geopolitical environment to negotiate, but I don't know if we're thinking about it, because I'm not privy to these discussions.
Yeah. See why we have hinted at what I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about. We've hinted at it. Sometimes you've been quite overt in talking about it. Sometimes not so direct. I'm talking here about the extremes. The anti-development extreme, as I refer to it, and the anti-national extreme. So we have these two extremes going at each other. Those who are anti-development and making the argument that it's better for us not to
Develop the oil.
leave the oil alone. And then you have those at the other end who are taking an extreme national position. How do you think we can balance those two factors?
I think there's a balance intrinsic in the realities of Guyana. And that balance is, like, many people have ignored because it's not important for them to want to say this. We are as well endowed with renewable resources, renewable energy resources, as we are with oil. So for us, it should never ever be a choice of one or the other. As long as the opportunity exists, it has to be both. Because we have a lot of poverty and we have to solve the problem of poverty first. We can't be beggars in the international community or have our people suffering from what some of them never experienced poverty and not being going to bed hungry and sleeping hungry, eating rice and sweetie. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. We have the capacity to do both, and we should try to ensure that the resources are used in such a way that both are done simultaneously,
Mm-hmm.
because we're not going to solve the poverty problems until we solve the other problems
Yeah.
that we have in the country. And how can you turn your eye on what God gave you? I'm not a religious man. It's not manna from heaven, but the world has reached a stage where we can find and produce the oil offshore. Very few firms or in institutions in the world, or even countries can do that. You can count them on one hand. Why should we relinquish that important technological breakthrough when we have renewable resources, renewable energy resources to come in to fill the gaps of whatever our domestic needs are, and also to service the hemisphere? I
Professor
think it's pure madness for somebody to ever say that we should leave the oil in the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
That's my
Professor Clive.
honest view. Somebody got
Yeah.
to be wrong, something got to be sick somewhere.
Mhm. Professor Clive Thomas, they're repeating what has been a thread throughout our discussions. Professor, is there anything that you wanted to say about the auctions that I have not asked you about?
Not at the moment. I think I am going through a series of articles and some of
Hmm.
these issues will be written on.
Right,
The series started on June 11th.
right.
I mean, it's Sunday's Tabrook. And right up until maybe the end of August, the last of the articles will be written. So it's a fairly extended coverage of articles dealing with the issues centering in the oil blocks, the auction of the oil block.
The auction of the oil blocks.
But this is a pivotal time, and I think we'll get a lot of empirical data to see how, in fact, after the prices risen, as they keep claiming, although they've never stated that they're aiming to maximize revenue. Let me tell you that they've never said this is their sole aim or even their aim, but it's implicit in everything that they do. But I don't think they've ever sat, maybe they never sat down to formulate their aim. But that's important because the public should know what are the goals the government setting for their block option. Because without that, you don't get public participation and knowledge about where to and how to evaluate what is taking place. But I'll assume that they're aiming to maximize revenues because every day they've been attacked on revenues, and
Yeah,
every day they feel that they have to defend the revenue issue.
yeah, yeah. And as we got, Professor, about a year ago, the IRI, the Republican Institute, had done a survey, and they found that not too many people, not a large section of our population, had taken an interest in the oil industry and the issues surrounding oil. You had a nuanced position, a nuanced reading of that finding. Um, uh, so I want to ask you if you think that a year on, that perception of people not being interested in the oil industry and the development surrounding oil might have changed.
No, I don't think it's as bad as the IRI had suggested.
Right, you
I
did
think
say so last year.
I think people do have an interest, but I think the difficulty is that the people are being fed misinformation, so we're not really getting informed commentary, and that is my concern. And it's not my responsibility because I'm a single scholar. They have the whole government apparatus there. They should be thinking seriously how to inform the public about what there is. And some of this flows from the fact the movement of the benefit from oil to their livelihoods are not understood because they never framed that way.
Hmm.
The government gets the handout and it hands out to build constituencies for itself. It doesn't try to build commitment to development for the country. And once you have that intermediation, oil is an alien industry. So people don't see this as part of our patrimony.
Yeah.
I think, and instead of being proud of what Guyana has been able to find or achieve, they feel that they have to be defensive and belittle it. For example, here people talk about inflation and the rise in prices. Now, in the United States, where you are now, when people talk about the rise in prices, they talk about it in relationship to the incomes they receive. But we never do that in Guyana. We have a survey of how people feel about the rise of prices, but always assuming that their incomes are the same. People, when they see it and it's put to them in that one sided way, will always feel only the negative part. But if you also tell them, or if they also realize that the growth of the economy per capita was 45%, then they're going to want to know why their purchasing power is not enough to take care of a 7% increase in interest rates and prices. They demand to know why it is that if we are going at 43% per annum, I must bother about a 7% rise in prices at the end of the world because the same figures from the same place. So you can have selective use of it. But you don't see it that way. And you see a paper survey, a 30th survey of how people feel about the rise in prices. And they will give you the one sided answer. But in doing that, they fail to connect, and you fail to encourage them to connect to see how it is we can push to fight poverty by making sure that if the overall economy grew so fast, 6 times the rise of prices, why should we be worse off? That's the question we should be asking.
Yeah. 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 And Professor, that is where I want us to go next.
Okay.
I want us to begin to link the oil and gas, the oil industry, and the developments in oil so far to the livelihood of peoples,
Yeah.
to real people and what's happening in their lives. We will eventually get to the Buxton proposal, but I want us to walk our way there. And one issue I want us to talk about as we move closer and closer to the Buxton proposal is to talk about how our historic ethnic problems, how they affect or don't affect um, our status as a petrol state, or how our status as a petrol state affects our ethnic problems, so that we talk about ethnicity and class and society as it relates to the oil industry. So I'm very glad we're ending on this note that we are ending. So it gives us a segue into talking about what all of this means for people's real lived experience. So once again, I want to thank you for coming on and to shed more than light on these issues and to help us make sense of what our future is going to be. Oil is here, and it's not going away as far as you forecast, at least for another 20-25 years. We have to deal with the present as well. Thank you very much, Professor, for today's program.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you, our audience, for staying with us as Professor Thomas walks us through this process. I think based on the comments I see, we are beginning to make sense. We are beginning to open up this conversation to include people's life, the relevance of all the technical, semi-technical stuff. What does this mean for people's lives? And I like Professor's thing about this inflation, which has become a term that is has been thrown around here in Guyana and the rest of the world. If the economy is growing at that rate, if it's going at that rate, and you have a 7%, why we are not able to be that 7%? For me, that is taking us to the nitty-gritty of this subject. Until next week, when we have another edition of the Open Word podcast and Guyana's Oil, this is David Hines thanking you for tuning in to yet another edition. And remember, we always strive here to inform and educate, but also learn, because that is the basis of public education. To inform, to educate, but also to learn as we go along. Thank you very much.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we woman and we children.